Welcome to the Humanist Freedoms podcast by Humanist Heritage Canada. Launching early in 2023, we share stories and perspectives from Canada's ongoing humanist heritage. You can find us online at www.humanistfreedoms.com or www.humanistheritagecanada.ca, where you may find the Humanist Freedoms news blog. Every week, we share news, information, and stories about what we call contemporary applied humanism. It's humanism in action. Humanist Heritage Canada is our new initiative to document and share the stories of Canada's rich humanist heritage. Henry Beissel is a Canadian poet who has published 24 volumes of poetry, 6 books of plays, and countless other articles and essays during a writing and teaching career that has spanned almost 60 years. He has also been an active humanist who's played important roles in several of Canada's leading humanist organizations. Today, we're going to begin exploration of Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory, a collection of essays which Henry states were previously delivered orally as talks or addresses on various public occasions. In view of the rapidly deteriorating situation across the world with accelerated climate change and its catastrophic consequences, the rapid global financial collapse, the growing threat of nuclear war, the population explosion that exceeds our planet's carrying capacity, all of which are combining to create serious episodes of famine, extreme poverty and exploitation, sickness, and spreading violence across the globe, Henry feels compelled to share these observations and to join those who are already warning of an imminent catastrophe unless we join forces to oppose the forces of destruction in the hope that humanity will weather the apocalypse and move on to create a more glorious world order of peace, compassion, and love. Henry says that a tough road lies ahead and only time can tell where it will take us. But without our full commitment to the forces of truth and creation, we have no future on earth. Despite such a startling and ominous theme and a great many pointed and dire concerns in the text, we think you will find Henry's observations to be not only important perspectives of a lifelong Canadian humanist, but also surprisingly hopeful and future-oriented. We'll be reading from Henry's newest title, Catastrophic Glory, and other essays in search of a viable future for humanity from a poet's perspective, and also speaking with Henry to ask questions that arise from his essays. Catastrophic Glory. 1. Evolution and Civilization. Glory. Webster's dictionary defines civilization as a state of social culture characterized by relative progress in the arts, science, and statecraft. In a general way, this definition can serve as a basis for our inquiry, provided we take the arts to include all pursuits and expressions of the human mind, such as philosophy, the study of history, and religion. By the same token, science has to include its various applications in technology as well as its effects on us and our environment. And statecraft must mean effective and honest governance, since anything less would be self-contradictory, government being the management of public affairs for the benefit of all. It seems self-evident that in all these areas, our history demonstrates constant and profound change, and a substantial part of it is relative progress. There are those who deny that there is any progress in human affairs. Human nature never changes, they say. Life is always the same. History repeats itself. Plus ça change. Under scrutiny, these commonplaces turn out to be forms of sophistry, word games in which definitions are used to verify claims by making them tautologist. If, for instance, you define human nature as that which is unchanging in us, then, by definition, It doesn't change. Clearly, this is a meaningless statement that cannot argue for or against change, and seems to me primarily an expression of a certain misanthropic pessimism some individuals enjoy cultivating. As animals, it is true our lives are always the same. We humans must put food in our stomachs, our hearts must beat, we need legs to move about, etc. These fundamental facts apply to all animals, subject to their specific environment. They do not describe needs that distinguish us as humans. We have made considerable progress even in this respect. For instance, the way we prepare and consume food, the way we move ourselves from one place to another, technology has changed all of that. Arguably, going to a restaurant to enjoy a filet mignon dinner constitutes progress over stalking an elk with bow and arrow, then skinning it before roasting it on a spit to make it edible. Not to labor the point, technology has dramatically extended the capacities of our limbs and senses in ways that even a millennium ago would have been inconceivable. These advances have changed not only our modes of living, but also our character. They have given us the illusion that we are rulers of the world and masters of our fate, and thereby, as we shall see, hangs a disastrous tale. Human nature is a highly intricate and constantly shifting phenomenon, a product of physiological, mental, emotional, and environmental elements that jointly create the ground for individual action and thought. The level of complexity at which these interact to compose us is well reflected in the fact that among the current 8 billion humans on a planet, there are no identical individuals. Change is perpetual because of the mixing of genes in conception and by way of the errors in copying DNA. This is how evolution has moved over 4 billion years from the simplicity of a single cell to the complexity of 100 trillion microbes that now cooperate to make primates functional. The changes that were necessary to accomplish this feat are so complex and numerous that we will never recover them in anything like the detail in which they have come and gone over the eons. Even the briefest survey of the fossils discovered around the globe suggests a breathtaking spectacle of life forms from the bizarre to the grandiose. Yet what paleontology has unearthed about the stages of evolution is less than the proverbial tip of an iceberg. What we do know is that it is Darwin's law of the survival of the fittest that gives direction to this complex, random process of evolution, which is otherwise a crapshoot game between survival and chance. A world without perpetual change is unthinkable. Motion means change. If everything that exists, from the elementary particles in the atom to the clusters of galaxies in the sky, came to a sudden halt, in that instant the universe would implode and vanish without a trace. Change is the measure of time and space. It has been with us from the beginning. Whether you judge such changes to be for the better or the worse depends on the criteria you apply. But as far as Homo sapiens is concerned, the mutations that produce the brain must be credited with the most magnificent achievement of evolution so far. How did nature accomplish this feat? Simply by a process Darwin identified as the law of natural selection that rules the natural order. It enacts a mechanism by which nature constantly opts for the survival of the fittest, those best fitted to survive the ever changing environment. The consequence is not only a dazzling diversity of organisms, but also their relentless and inevitable improvement. Animal life means motion, and motion requires energy. But usable energy, which we call food, is scarce and often hard to come by. This limited availability inevitably sets limits to the number of creatures that depend on it and produces a brutal competition for the vital food in the evolution of animals from the beginning. The fittest in that competition was inevitably the creature most adept at finding food, evading predators, dominating the tribe, and connecting with mates. To do that effectively depended on the level of awareness of the environment, the ability to accurately and quickly see, hear, taste, feel, sense what was happening in the immediate environment. Thus, the selection of the fittest guaranteed the maximum development of each creature's sensory apparatus, resulting in growing awareness and eventually climaxing in self consciousness. That's how Homo sapiens rose to the top of the heap. The brain was prefigured in the evolution of life from the start, but it took almost 4 billion years for nature to reach the necessary level of complexity. The enlargement of the cranium was a major step on this evolutionary road in order to accommodate a larger brain, a necessary change before primates could embark on a journey that has changed the world utterly. It took the neocortex about 2 million years to reorganize primitive utterances and sound signals into change, and another 50,000 years to refine language to enable abstract thought and sophisticated communication. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, said Rene Descartes, putting his finger on the most extraordinary phenomenon on this planet. Language is what makes us human. This single evolutionary change has given rise to a species that has conquered and changed, explored and exploited the entire planet. The blossoming of the human imagination, the flowering of the arts and sciences, the apotheosis of technology, everything that goes into the making of a civilization is unthinkable without language. And if the ability of a species to propagate in reckless abundance and to occupy virtually every space on Earth is any measure, Homo sapiens is a success story par excellence. Though, as we shall see, that success comes with a high cost to our species and our planet. Civilization emerges from the collaboration of people sharing a living space and a language, and their success in creating civil order. Ultimately, it is the sum of the different contributions made to the community by all its members. How each individual puts to use the energies that materialize as body and mind, and what opportunities society offers to bring us to fruition our innate talents and skills, determines the quality of life for each and every one of us. That quality varies a great deal in the unfolding of every individual's expertise and commitment, and therefore across the whole spectrum of any population. Until not much more than a century ago, it was taken for granted in our part of the world that the son, often for practical reasons, would pursue the occupation, the craft, the profession of the father. A farmer's son was expected to be a farmer, and a miner's son would go down into the mine too. A shoemaker's son became a shoemaker. Of course, in past centuries, families with a dozen children were not uncommon, and the males couldn't all follow in the footsteps of father. But social class prejudice and a lack of access to education generally restricted their opportunities to manual labor at the family's economic level. Only the military and the clergy offered a way up and out. Times have changed significantly. A Welsh friend of mine in England, whose father was a coal miner, became a senior lecturer in literature at Cambridge University. For that matter, my own ancestors were farmers, some of whom are described in the records as plowmen and musician. Yet I retired from a 30-year academic career as a distinguished emeritus professor. Social mobility on this scale is a recent phenomenon. It gives each of us new scope for self fulfillment, allowing us to choose an occupation more in keeping with our personal interests and talents, while at the same time providing us with greater economic means. We still have a long way to go to achieve full social justice in terms of equal opportunity and equal recompense for all, but the progress we have made so far has significantly improved the quality of most people's lives. This evolution has also benefited women. Until recently, children, church, and chores circumscribed most women's lives. They were not even given the vote until about a century ago. Since then, the situation has changed dramatically, at least in Western civilization. Today, women not only cast their vote, they are also themselves voted into political office, though not yet in sufficient numbers to befit a true democracy. Still, even if they still face some male prejudices, they are free to engage in any trade and profession and are thus able to fulfill their individual potential in more ways than that of being mother and wife. Though I do not wish to deprecate the important task of raising children, nor to promote the idea of quotas for men and women in different professions. We are all led to different professional commitments by our different talents and dispositions. To argue that gender differences based on our different biological functions do not play a role in this process simply reveals a colossal ignorance of the holistic integrity in the order of nature. But of course, these differences must not become the basis for discrimination. At any rate, while the full implications of these changes still have to pass the test of positive sustainability, in the long run, it constitutes another clear case of progress since freedom of choice is an enhancement of any individual's life. I should make it clear that in the whole of this inquiry, I'm speaking of developments and conditions in Western civilization. I do so not in any spirit of competition with others or out of any sense of triumph, contrition, or defeat, but simply as a descriptive exercise to establish the bearings for the society in which I grew up and continue to live. It is left to the informed reader to engage the parallels to and divergences from other civilizations and cultures. For us, it is valid to claim that the quality of life has improved over time in many different ways for all people. I was a specialist in medieval literature, and I can assure you that no one in his or her right sense would want to exchange life today for life in, say, the 12th century, except perhaps those in the rank of bishop or king at the time. Since then, living conditions have improved dramatically as men and women liberated themselves from conditions of servitude and suffering that today, even in the most underdeveloped countries of the world, lead to public protest and revolt. But, the skeptic objects, if this is progress, are people any happier today than they were, say, a millennium ago? Let us assume that we know what happiness means and that it is the sole criterion for the success of a civilization. At a later point in my argument, it will be necessary to examine our desire for happiness and what it entails. For now, it suffices to admit that without an objective measure, the skeptic's question cannot be answered conclusively. On a scale from 1 to 10, how happy do you feel today? Your psychologist may ask you. If you say 6 and I say 8, we may just be saying the same thing because there are no absolute standards to measure happiness. Provided the information is given freely and honestly, all we can do is take the person's word for it. If you say you're happy, it's fair to assume that you are. The fact that the statement reflects very different perceptions of what happiness means is part of the freedom we cherish. Whichever way we define happiness, it is true to say that today, a significantly larger proportion of human beings in our civilization are happier than they were in the Middle Ages. However, happiness too is relative. We Northerners know what it feels like to go out on a January day in winter and find the temperature has risen by 20 degrees since the day before, from minus 20 Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius. We take off our anoraks, roll up our sleeves, and talk of spring. We are happy. The same reversal of temperature from plus 20 Celsius on a summer's day would make 0 degrees Celsius feel like a bitter Arctic assault and send us scurrying for our winter clothing. We adapt to changing conditions and experiences, not according to objective scientific measures, but subjectively in the terms of the level of adaptation. Such adaptation necessarily affects our perception of happiness. Anyone who has traveled in third world countries and spent time with ordinary people will have been struck by the joyfulness of lives deprived of many of the amenities without which we would feel miserable. Some of this lightness of being derives from the fact that possessions weigh us down and that those who own little live more freely, more joyfully. And this is not intended to defend poverty, but to remember that possessions make constant demands on our time and attention. Much of joyfulness is a product of adapting to doing without luxuries, of finding the source of joy inside ourselves within the context of things as they are. How many of us today would be able to live happily under the conditions of the pioneers to this country 2 or 3 centuries ago, without electricity, without running water, without engines or machines to work for us, shivering in dingy, smoke-filled log cabins in winter, plagued by insects in summer, virtually without medical help, and dependent almost entirely on the food we could grow or raise ourselves? Yet our ancestors enjoyed life in Canada much as we do, certainly a lot more than we would under the same circumstances today. The devastating ice storm of 1998 in Ontario and Quebec gave us a hint of what life was like for our pioneer ancestors. And I didn't see too many happy campers in this neck of the woods where we had to do without electricity, and therefore without heat, light, and water for as little as 3 weeks. We have adapted to a way of life today that would have appeared pampered, even decadent, to the early pioneers. We require and expect more from the world today in order to be happy, and we regard attributes of comfort and leisure as features of advancing civilization. As we shall see, there is a dark, negative side to this too. But it's no doubt a consequence of adaptation that the further we go back in our history, the higher the levels of tolerance for physical pain, economic slavery, and political bondage, and the lower the expectations that make human beings happy. Of course, there are limits to the minimum conditions to which we can adapt happily. Some things you can't get used to. When food supplies dwindle to the point of starvation, when rulers become despots for whom their subjects are chattel, when young women are raped with iniquity, when men are forced to slaughter or be slaughtered in wars for the sole benefit of such rulers, when dissenters are tortured to death because their views displease the local duke or bishop, when sickness kills most of the newborns and often their mothers, when medical surgery is performed by barbers who saw off your leg without anesthetic, then those limits of tolerance are reached. Yet such were the conditions of life a millennium ago. No one who has studied the Middle Ages will want to dispute that developments in the arts, science, and statecraft since then constitute a considerable advance in civilization, and we are all of us the better for it. The God of the Christians who expelled Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden to condemn them to eat their bread by the sweat of their face may have sounded credible in the medieval world, but today he cuts a comical figure, a crusty, misanthropic spoilsport, too old to appreciate the joys of living. We no longer accept suffering as an essential and ennobling feature in an unchangeable divine order. That is the dogmatic currency in which those deal who inflict suffering on others who are unwilling to contribute to relieving it. The improvements in the quality of our lives are spectacular. They encompass virtually every facet of our daily existence. Progress in medicine, for instance, has led us to the defeat or control of many diseases that were once a scourge to mankind. Thus, for instance, in Western nations, there has been a dramatic decrease in infant mortality from around 50% to 4.5 per thousand births in 2017, and an equally dramatic increase in the average life expectancy that was roughly 30 years for a male child a millennium ago and is now 80 years. Advances in transportation and communication are similarly staggering. We can travel distances in hours today that would have taken months to traverse in medieval times. Today, we can speak to each other instantly from one end of the earth to the other and look each other in the face as we do so, because we send billions of coded signals through the air, across oceans and mountains, and or bounce them off satellites to become visible as images of ourselves and our world on screens we can hold in our hands. It is sheer magic, and we are already so accustomed to it that we take it for granted. But we should beware. The current COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates dramatically that nature always retains the upper hand. The struggle for survival and civilization never ends. Steam and gasoline engines have given birth to modes of locomotion that would have belonged to the world of fairy tales or science fiction if anyone had ever dreamed of them a millennium ago. Even today, there are farmers, such as in the rural community where I lived, who haven't traveled 100 miles beyond their fields and stables. But their children take holidays in Mexico, Hawaii, and Thailand for granted. We have traveled to the moon and will soon be on our way to Mars and beyond. We are decoding the genome, record of and recipe for the evolution of all life. We are beginning to understand what brought the universe into being and how time space exploded in a void filled with dark energy where subatomic particles reorganize themselves into the complexities of galaxies, minerals, and eventually life. In the arts, progress can perhaps be measured in terms of technique of various materials and in terms of the place works of art are accorded in society at large. But art, as such, makes no progress. A self portrait by Van Gogh is no improvement on one by Rembrandt, any more than Bartók's piano concertos constitute progress from Mozart's, or Joyce's Ulysses is one up on Homer's Odyssey. A work of art is the expression of an individual's visionary insight into the complexities of human existence embodied in the language of its time. It addresses us in the totality of our being as creatures of imagination, reason, and emotion. And its object is to move us to understand and accept the fragility and transitoriness of our lives, to appreciate the grandeur of the universe in which we find ourselves, and to point to the ultimate mystery that surrounds us on all sides. Artists can and do hone their skills, but that's personal progress, not progress in the art they practice. Also, you can improve the technology of producing a work of art, say through the manner of musical notation or structural improvements in a musical instrument, or by the advantages of the computer over the quill, or the considerable advances in the construction of buildings. None of these changes constitute progress in the art such refinements facilitate. The fragility and the mystery remain, whatever the optic of the period through which they are filtered. The success of a work of art is a function of the creative powers of the artists, not of the sophistication of tools or the acrobatics of the performance. The Eiffel Tower may be a more advanced architectural feat than the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, but it is not a more advanced work of art. A medieval Gregorian chant is as profoundly moving as the choral climax of Beethoven's Ninth. A modern rock concert, for all its ear splitting decibels, optical hype, and the hysterical exhibitionism of its performance, has nothing over either of them. The greatness of a work of art is measured by the extent to which the artist succeeds in embodying his or her vision in music, painting, or poetry, so as to touch our innermost being by conveying a sense of the ultimate mystery at the heart of all things. As we remarked earlier, one form of progress in the arts can be measured by the value society places on works of art, the extent to which they become part of everyday life, the importance they have in the education of the young, the support given to their creators, and the degree to which the artworks are made accessible to all members of the community. These determine the status of a civilization. The evidence for progress in this respect in our Western civilization is all around us. Over the centuries, all the arts have come to flourish, and today their works enrich every facet of our lives. We are surrounded by museums, galleries, concert halls, and libraries that house our artworks and offer them to everyone for their enjoyment and edification. Our private homes are filled with music, books, paintings, or the reproduction thereof, and sculptures. Artists are no longer hirelings at the mercy of their patrons, though their social conditions still leave much to be desired. But many can make a living from their art, and many more are supported in different ways by the community. The result is an abundance of artistic creation in our time that would appear to be unparalleled in our own history. The most telling example of progress in the arts is literature. The people of Europe in the Middle Ages and for the millennia preceding them were largely illiterate, except for the clergy and a tiny class of the rich and powerful, and not even all of them could read and write. Access to literature was thus limited to a somewhat tenuous oral tradition and to the politically correct parables delivered at Sunday Mass by the local priest to awed parishioners. The difference today, when the literature of the entire world, past and present, is but a bookstore, a library, or an internet click away from us, couldn't be more momentous. The most momentous development respecting the literary arts has been the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. It revolutionized our civilization because it initiated a major shift from an oral to a visual culture. Communication was transferred from the mouth to ear channel to the page to eye path. If the pen recorded the voice, the press multiplied and distributed the recording as a book across vast spaces and independent of time. It was as if a single voice had acquired a myriad mouths so that it could be heard anywhere, anytime. The printing press made the voice visible and reproducible, affecting not only the dissemination of literature, but all of knowledge. It unleashed a flood of learning unprecedented in human history. From being the privilege of a tiny clique of the powerful, mostly the clergy during the first millennium of our era, education gradually became available and eventually necessary to more and more individuals. Until today, it is an essential part of everyone's life in our culture. The digital revolution has accelerated this development dramatically by making all knowledge instantly accessible everywhere. The computer transmits any printed text across continents in an instant, and an app can project our voices around the globe at the speed of light. The consequences of this cultural revolution are only beginning to be realized, but it is clear that they will be profound and will change every facet of our lives: shopping, education, politics, the arts and sciences. One change is inescapable. Education has fueled, and in turn is fueled, by the desire of the population at large for a new kind of civilization, one that is perhaps most succinctly prefigured in the ill-fated French Revolution's anguished call for liberté, égalité, fraternité. The easy dissemination of literature, ideas, and knowledge created the conditions for the physical and mental liberation of the masses. For centuries, they languished in the ignorance and superstitions propagated by church and state, determined to perpetuate their own privileges. Public education was a wake up call. As it spread, ordinary people became aware of larger historical processes involving more liberal political ideas. The work and wisdom of classical antiquity were rediscovered, and great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle became part of the evolution of ideas that inspired the revolutionary minds of a new age. Slowly, it dawned on common people that a feudal society was not, as their priests had told them, a God given order, that it was a sacrilege to try and change. They grew tired of working like donkeys and, in times of war, slaughtering and being slaughtered, while their sovereigns indulged in all the luxuries and pleasures of life. Once they saw through the demagoguery and abuse by those who ruled them, it was change that they wanted, and they still want it. It took centuries of struggle on many fronts and cost the lives of many fighters for our freedom before the whole idea of government changed, step by step, and the supreme achievement of Athenian civilization was reborn. Democracy, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. A new social order had to be created in which all people are equal and in which their individual rights and freedoms are protected. This has involved establishing the rule of just laws and electoral procedures to ensure that the will of the people and social justice prevail everywhere and at all times. It is only in the last century that Euro-American civilization has come close to making these age-old dreams come true. But as we shall see, that very process of liberation has been used to enslave the majority of people. The so-called democratic process to liberate people has become a charade now, a pretense of advanced civilization that is but a mask for the exploitation and abuse of common people by the rich. And that takes us, at internet speed, to the dark and destructive side of our civilization as we turn what was glorious into what is catastrophic. Should you wish to obtain a copy of Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory, you can inquire at humanistfreedoms@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to pass your inquiry along. Thank you for taking time to visit the Humanist Freedoms podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed putting the show together. If you liked this or any episode of the podcast, please consider subscribing or leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a humanist story idea, or feedback to share, you can reach us at humanistfreedoms@gmail.com.